Program. We have this public is welcome to address the Redistricting Committee on items of interest to be public. They're not on the agenda. And the comments of the committee are limited to a maximum of 5 minutes or 250 words for comments provided via email to the redistricting at sjgov.org. And doing so, may I remind everyone to please refrain from personal attacks and the use of offensive language. Okay? Mr. Kwong, do you want to do the housekeeping, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair and members of. What I wanted to do is just go through some housekeeping issues, as you mentioned. Just as a reminder, there are restrooms just outside the door to our left. There are vending machines in that break room as well. And then we also have, just as a reminder, some emergency evacuation instructions that we'll be here to direct you out if we need to, but we'll basically meet across this room. And once outside, we would use a crosswalk and at San Joaquin and Weber to cross over the other side towards the courthouse. And we'll meet at the shaded area of the corner of San Joaquin and Weber if this is ever necessary. And then, of course, also throughout the training session and the meeting today, staff will be monitoring comments through chat. They will be monitored and recorded. And from that standpoint, we'll try to address the questions through chat as they come about. And with that, Chair, I will give it back to you. Thank you.
It looks like the president's office wanted to know what we're doing on the redistricting committee. So, could we please stand for the flag salute? Please join me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Sonia, may we have roll call?
Steve Brum.
Present.
Pamela Ibeck.
Present.
Alice English.
Present.
Ann Baird. Here. Bob Mooney.
Present.
James Grunsky. Mike Morowitz.
Present.
Oscar Valdez. Summers Panino. Angel Ann Flores. Acel Hernandez. Maybe Star. Richard Silverman.
Thank you very much. The first action item is the minutes from the 6:30 meeting. Has everyone had an opportunity to look at those items? Anyone who is on Zoom, any questions about the items that were on the agenda from the 6:30 meeting? Okay, now I'm going to bring it back here. Go ahead, Pam.
I have a question about the minutes, and I noticed the minutes were limited to action items, and my question is whether we should include in the minutes summary of general hours, because action, and I would recommend that there be one or maybe two sentences, went through training, had training so that we are learning how to do this job.
I think that's an excellent point. And then what we can do is so we can accept the minutes with a motion to approve. And at the next meeting, there will be amendments to it. And they will add those and then approve the amendments at that time. Okay?
Motion to approve, what our chairperson just described.
Been properly moved and seconded to move on the items of the 6:30 board meeting with the amendments to be added to cover the meeting. All in favor, signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
On Zoom. Alice, anyone else?
Aye.
Any abstentions? Okay, thank you. All right, motion carries. Moving on to item 4, any agenda additions or deletions? I want to introduce Mr. Izu Hernandez, who is the alternate for District 2. Is Mr. Hernandez here today? On Zoom? Okay. And then also at this point, I want to add a congressional update from the COA office. Could you please provide us that information?
Just want to announce, Steve, that I've joined the meeting. This is Rich.
Hello, Mr. Silverman.
Some of you may have already been contacted about the congressional redistricting effort. And on that front, that is a process that was running in tandem, but separate from the supervisorial redistricting front. And on the congressional redistricting front, that is essentially to protect an effort to hire a firm to protect the county's interests at the state level through the state redistricting process. So at the board meeting yesterday, there was an item that was scheduled. There was a consulting firm that had been selected back in, I believe it was January, and because of a potential conflict of interest, that contract was rescinded essentially and did not move forward. So the CAO's office is working right now to see how we can move forward still with those efforts of protecting the county's interests at the state level. And we do have a meeting scheduled tomorrow with community development and CAO's office to see if there's some overlapping services that are occurring on the supervisorial front that may also be of benefit on the congressional side. For instance, reaching out to those communities of interest and at those outreach meetings and gathering data that way. So if you do receive any questions, they are two separate processes. One is at the state level, and if you hear the supervisorial one, that's at the local level. So local, our Board of Supervisors district boundaries. And we will provide more information at the next meeting, but that process is underway to see if we can, that will move forward as far as representing the county at the state level as well for the congressional redistricting efforts. Absolutely. I'll continue to keep everybody informed, and we can either do it at these meetings, or if it's more time sensitive, we'll send out an email to the entire committee. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions from online or from anyone here in the room? Very good. Thank you. Okay. So we're now going to go on to public comment. We'll first go to Zoom. Is there anyone on Zoom that has any public comment? Seeing none, we'll go to Sonia, the chat. No public comments? Okay, and then from the room, do we have anyone in the room that has public comment? Seeing none, then we'll go to Glenn.
All right, so we have a redistricting email address, so I want to make sure the RAC members are all aware of that. And we've been receiving some interesting emails, some very colorful, but some also on point. And Dave has graciously put together a compilation of those emails, and they are attached to your meeting invite. So you'll get the full appreciation kind of the range of comments. But I did want to share with you, just so you can appreciate the range, I have summarized a few of them. One, so I've got 7 here. 1, keep the redistricting lines on the east side of Alamont. 2, I live in District 5 and I'm satisfied with the current map as drawn. I know the boundaries will change due to population changes, but I encourage the committee and board to maintain boundaries that are consistent with representation and population trends. 3, does the map include the vast number of homeless living primarily in San Joaquin County waterways? 4, please draw fair district lines. I'm tired of the continuous gerrymandering. 5, no marijuana sites in Lockford. 6, I would like to see the Lincoln area in Stockton to be redirected so we are able to vote for the mayor of Stockton. 7, this is my favorite, this seems to be a most valuable program. Yes. So among the emails, we did get a COI submission. So that's a community of interest form for District 4. And they call themselves the Ag Protecting and Development, Ag Growth and Expansion. So they're on our radar now. And then we also got a request to present, and it's to the Stockton Young Women's Task Force. And David Kwong and Dave Bollinger and myself, we're going to go ahead and conduct that presentation, and we're coordinating that. So, but it's also why we have the talking points today that we'll be reviewing with you all. So as you get invitations to present, you'll feel like you can go in and do so with confidence and kind of understand what the guardrails are. So those are that's the summary, Chair.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Anyone else? Any questions from Zoom? None? Nothing on the chat? Okay, how about here? Any questions? Excellent. Okay, we'll move on. Is there any member disclosures from the RAC committee? Okay, moving on. So the RAC community contacts.
And so just to explain this, because I don't believe we had this on the agenda last time, what we want to capture are those contacts our RAC members have had with communities of interest or other groups. And a lot of it's just so we can get that on record. And then similarly, so your fellow members can appreciate with whom you've met, so they won't be trying to line up presentations and such. And we can also do our best in trying to help you coordinate those presentations. So that's really what we're trying to capture there. So in case, and what we're going to do is we'll have this on the agenda every time we meet, and we'll just want to hear about any of those community of interest contacts that you've had in that 2-week or 3-week span between meetings. I think all 3 of those fall into that bucket, because then you've already established a relationship. So for example, we disclosed, in a sense, that we're going to be meeting with the Stockton Young Women's Task Force. So I wouldn't expect any of the RAC members to be reaching out to them, knowing that we're covering that ground right now. And similarly, if you were to disclose that as one of your community contacts, then we would either co-present with you or wish you all the best as you're presenting to them.
I have a question. Should Summer and I, both from District 4, meet with the ag community of interest that self-identified itself?
I think it's a fair question, and I'll let the chair kind of field that, and I know David might want to jump in on that too, but my impression is that we are encouraging you to be ambassadors, and that's why we're arming you with these talking points. And so long as you're kind of sticking within the guardrails, we want to get the message out. We want to encourage our communities of interest and engage them in this process. So please do. I think it's an expectation.
Long, any comments?
Thank you. I just want to echo those comments to the extent that those guardrails that Glenn referred to are basically, as you engage in conversation with them, either as a group or individually, that you don't take a position on any of the communities of interest at this time. Any kind of work like that should be done in the forum of the RAC itself.
It's more about the education process that we would go through to alert them what is expected from not only the RAC committee, what is expected from the members of the community. As to get us to a point that at the end of the day, when the lines are drawn, we make the presentation, we provide that information to the Board of Supervisors. They make the final decision on all of that.
That is correct, yes.
Excellent. Any other comments, questions? Yes, ma'am. I think it's very important that you convey whatever information that you can, because you're an alternate, you are representing the county. You may not be in the mix of making those final decisions, but at any point in time when you can educate the public, I think that's what is important. Yes, ma'am.
Afternoon, Chair. This is Samantha Moss, County Council. I just want to make sure I knew that this would open up the floodgates of questions, and I just wanted to put your minds at ease. We are going to go into a little bit more detail, as this is a standing item on the agenda to discuss, disclosures and contacts. I always like the keep it simple, stupid method. So really, it's about engaging them by informing them about what we do and what the process entails and what is on our agenda coming up, right? We want them to come and preferably speak here. So it's about getting them excited about the process. If I would say, just as a simple guardrail for now, in addition to the talking points we'll go through, is we've got our conflicts of interest that you'll want to disclose if you've got a financial conflict and all that. But as far as contacts are concerned, if they give you information that is informative to the committee, right, to the RAC, that would be something we'd want to bring and share, because then it's informing the decision-making process, right, and the individuals involved. But we would hope that you would not give your own opinion. And we will go into that in more detail, but we want to engage them, we want to inform them, we want to invite them to participate. But if they have a concerning item or an issue that they want to talk about, we want to bring that to the board and encourage them to show up as well.
Yes, Ann.
Ordinarily, when I talk to people, they just sort of stare at me. So there's not really much. Yeah, there's not really much response. So I've emailed people who haven't emailed me back. So I don't think that people are that engaged with the process. So do you want a whole list of everybody I've emailed, or do you care, even if they haven't emailed me back?
Well, I mean, I would defer to what the chair would like, but I would say that as far as contacts, maybe just keeping a running list, of who you try to engage.
Okay.
I do believe that that is important, that we maintain a list, or each individual maintain that list, because at any point in time, if there's ever a question, you've got the information to support everything that we do, and about being transparent with the people in the county.
Okay, I got to go back and look at it. I got it somewhere. I'll find it and have it for you next time, or send it to Glenn, right?
Yes.
And adding to that, so when it comes to the RAC community contacts on the agenda, we're really looking for those communities of interest or those organizations. Now, if that individual you reached out to is president of the organization, yeah, then we want to know about that.
Or some officer or somebody who's higher up in the.
Absolutely. So I think that would
Okay.
qualify as reaching out or connecting with that organization.
Any other questions? Online? Any questions from the chat? Okay, so we will move on to the next item, which is the redistricting talking points. Ms. Liz Stitt from Redistricting Partners. Please welcome. Well, probably if you grab the microphone, that's one place to start.
Right. Well,
Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for having me here. Good afternoon. Sounds like you all nailed it on the head. So we drafted these talking points for you to go out into the public, recruit people to come give testimony at these hearings or online. So basically, it just goes through.
Hang on 1 second. Are we picking up the volume? You're getting in the back? Okay, thank you.
So it goes through what is redistricting, why it matters for their communities, and how they can get involved. So like you said, this is a guardrail for people. We do caution, again, to not go beyond these talking points. So that way everybody is on the same message, everyone's accurate, and encourage people to provide testimony at one of these hearings or online so their voices have the largest impact as possible. So with that, I turn it back over to you.
Question.
Thank you very much for putting these together. And I think they'll be very helpful. One question I have, and forgive me for being so naive, but other than deciding who votes for, what the district is for a county supervisor and who the voting population is for that position, what else do these districts determine in the county? Are there any local issues that the district has authority over? Or is this purely what group of people are voting for a specific position on the Board of Supervisors? So maybe this goes to our county folks.
Yeah, I think
we need something so that people will get excited about it.
So, Mr. Kwong?
Okay. Chair, this is probably going to go deep into a judgment call later on as you actually get into the work, because certain communities of interest will want to be in certain supervisory districts for one reason or another. And as you get those maps and you draw those lines, you may be compelled to go one way or the other. And it does matter to the communities of interest as to which district they go into. And you're going to have to come to that critical analysis point on which side they fall in. So just an example, the growth that has occurred in the county in the last 10 years has been significant in Mountain House and in the cities of Lathrop, Tracy, and Manteca, not to mention Stockton has its own growth too. But that, and I'm not trying to sway this anyway, I'm just giving it as an example. that means it's being growing southwesterly. And you would think that might cause some changes at the southwesterly side. What's going to happen then is as those lines may move, and I'll just say may move southwesterly, that means the lines where they are at the north side could shrink too. So that means communities of interest that are currently today may not be in the same supervisorial district anymore and feel like as if they don't have enough influence in a certain district. So that's going to be the heart of the work that you're going to get once we get census data from the state. And at that point, it does matter in terms of importance, more importance, how you feel depending on the groups that come out and the communities of interest that come out and how they draw lines and whether you agree, disagree, or have your own analysis. And it's a little bit vague because we're not into the actual work. Part of it is that we're not going to truly know until we have that state the census data. We will have some preliminary data through the American Community Survey, but from that standpoint, you'll get an indication. But that's the critical analysis going to have to play into where this committee at that point feels like, okay, yeah, it may seem like it's just moving from one district to another, but it matters to the community from that perspective.
Mr. Feller?
Yeah, and I just want to underscore what David said. So it's a matter of representation. So communities of interest are going to identify, right, with their community, and they're going to want to preserve that community. So you don't want to, like they say, crack the community and break it up into an egg in all these different districts. So you want to preserve those. Likewise, from a numbers standpoint, we want to have that equal distribution of our citizens in those and individuals in those districts. So one district, you don't feel like we're so impacted with individuals here, I can't get the attention of my supervisor, whereas the other obviously has greater access. So it's balancing, I think, all of those and being mindful. And if you think about representation and all that it connotes, I think that'll really, really help.
Okay, so what I'm hearing you say is don't discount the importance of where these supervisory district lines go, and that they do have significant stake, or many communities of interest have significant stake in where those lines are. And so what I'm also hearing is that these district lines determine the supervisor's set of voting public, whatever it is, but that there aren't any other unique functions related to water, crime, taxation, et cetera, that would be determined solely within that district. It's just your representative to the county where those decisions are made at the county level.
Right. I mean, that's not the criteria you're going to use. And as far as being mindful of the lines, like you said, where they are, it's really about where they need to be is what we need to pay attention to. So rather than where they were, it's where do the lines currently need to be, and that's going to be your task in trying to assess that collectively. And it looks like, David, you want to add to that?
Use the one inquiry from the farming community. Obviously, they made that emphasis because they want to keep that intact. So if all of a sudden that line changes so much that they no longer have their communities of interest, that farming community, as strong as they wanted to be, because the lines moved into all of a sudden, let's say, City of Stockton, then theoretically, I'll say it like that, all of a sudden, the influence is not as strong, right? Because you have a very dense population in the City of Stockton who may not have the same perspective. And I'm just throwing that out as a scenario. And again, not to influence you. So.
And you bring out an excellent point in the fact, and I'll just go back to the issue of water. Water has an impact on all 5 districts, and so however they make that decision, it all comes together. So, for example, if someone in District 1 brings something forward to the Board of Soups, all the Board of Soups is going to weigh in on those specific issues dealing with that water because, and have their input as we continue to go forward. So that's some excellent communication that we just talked about and things to be considered. Anything online that, any questions in regards to this topic? Says they're talking, okay. You do have a comment in chat? Okay. And just, the comment came up before you speak, would you please introduce yourselves so the people on the Zoom understands or knows who's talking? Excellent point. Thank you very much. Did you say there was something on chat? Oh, gotcha. Thank you very much. I'm with you. Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Okay. Liz, are you going to introduce our Mr. Hodges? Okay.
Yeah, he should be on the Zoom, Taylor.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mr. Hodges is with Redistricting Partners. So would you proceed forward, please?
Absolutely. Nice to be here and see everyone. Again, my name is Taylor Hodges, and I'm helping the county with their community engagement and communications efforts for the redistricting process. So I just wanted to give a brief update on our efforts so far and also what we're planning to do. First of all, the website has been launched and it can be found at wedrawthelines.sjcgov.org. So on that website, visitors can find meeting materials, they can submit comments via an online form, they can sign up for email updates and get information on how to participate in the process further. And of course, the website is also available in Spanish and many other languages through a translate function. Additional efforts to engage county residents include emailing letters to more than 175,000 residents, among whom are elected officials and partners, and just folks who live in the county. And we're encouraging them to share that same message with their email listservs and their family and friends just to get the word out about the effort. So we're working on some helpful informational materials right now, like a redistricting overview fact sheet, and that should be online soon. For notifications about the process, we're issuing press releases and we'll be placing advertisements in the Latino Times and some other news sources. We'll be distributing notifications with a utility bill insert and posting social media updates on Facebook and Twitter. We're also in the process of working on an educational video about the redistricting process that we'll post on the website and distribute that widely to residents and communities of interest so that they can understand what we're doing and how they can participate. And as we heard from Glenn, the process has the potential to have an impact on the representation of the people of the county. So I just want to commend the county for their commitment to a really genuine and robust engagement process. And I think it's one that's going to be really successful. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that folks might have.
Do we have any questions? Anyone online have any questions?
We got one in the chat that says, which utilities? And
which utilities?
Yeah, Mr. Bollinger, can you answer that one?
We'll be doing a utility bill insert for all of the areas served by our county public works currently, which are CSA's community service areas and MD's maintenance districts. And we will explore other utility bill options. We've approached PG&E, but so far been unsuccessful. We'll also attempt AT&T or other locals that we can make any inroads with.
How about the cities that could provide that in their monthly bills?
If they're amenable to it, we'll approach them and attempt.
Any other questions from online? But in here, Ms. Baird.
Yeah, is there a timeline? What's the timeline for all of this? When are you going to start?
We already have started. We have done one press release and we've sent out that 175,000 resident letter, but this is something that we're just going to continue to do, especially leading up to the major participation opportunities such as the outreach hearings and when we get the census and the maps. So we actually did just upload kind of timeline graphic to the website. It looks pretty slick. So you can take a look at that and it'll give you a better idea.
Any other questions in here? Mr. Mooney?
Was that email sent out? Was that part of that, your mailing? I know my wife got an email, I got an email about it.
Yeah, sorry, I don't understand the question.
Was that sent out in email forms? Mr. Mooney indicated both he and his wife both got emails.
That's correct. Yeah, glad you got it.
Okay, go right ahead.
So it's great to hear, Robert, that you got that. That means it's working. You know, and to Taylor's point is don't just read it, pass these along. So this is kind of going back, Pam, to what you said, like help us spread the word within your districts so we can really get that message out. But I did want to give a shout out to Redistricting Partners. They've been very helpful in assisting us and supporting us with this outreach effort. This is very robust, and Taylor's talking about it quite humbly, but he's been working like a dog on this thing. And I got to tell you, like what we've done and where we're going with it, we are leaps and bounds, I'd say, above and beyond most counties in the state. So you got to recognize that. Yeah, we're Redistricting Partners has really been a true valued partner. So thank you to them.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Online? In the room? Seeing none, we'll move on to item number 10, and that is the RAC training session number 2, federal and state laws and community interest. Ms. Stitt, are you going to introduce Mr. Angelo Anchetta?
I can go ahead and jump in here. This is Connie Malloy.
Oh, there you are.
Yes, you got a great Redistricting Partners team here, both in the room and also virtually. It's wonderful to see you all again. Just checking, is the volume good on my end?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, wonderful. I will be brief so we can get right to the heart of the presentation today. You are really in for a great educational session around redistricting, and we will be joined momentarily by Angelo Anchetta. Professor Anchetta is a well-known both practicing attorney, professor, and legal scholar. He has taught both here in California at Santa Clara University most recently, also at the University of California in Los Angeles, but also on the East Coast, both at New York University and at Harvard. And what is really unique, I think, about what he will be able to present in terms of the laws pertaining to redistricting is that he has both the theory, the law, the technical expertise, but he has also had to put that to use. He's also led nonprofit organizations providing legal services in the realm of voting rights and immigration, et cetera. And he also had to test out his prowess by being part of the state level redistricting commission in the last cycle. And so he certainly has been in your shoes. And what he'll do is he will provide a lay of the land as it relates to federal redistricting law, with a particular emphasis on the Voting Rights Act and the implications as it relates to the work that you are about to do. And then he will also go really deep into communities of interest, which I know has been a topic of conversation. It's really, a critical thing to understand as it relates to the public outreach process that you are developing and launching in partnership with redistricting partners. So with that, I will invite Professor Anchetta to join us on video and to launch right in. So this will be, given the substance that we'll cover this presentation, we'll go a little bit over an hour, and then we'll have time for questions. And I think Professor Anchetta, if you also, maybe at the point when you transition from the legal parameters into the communities of interest, maybe that might be a good moment also to take a pause and see if there are questions at that juncture. So thanks so much. I'll pass it off.
Great, thank you, Connie. So just a logistical question. Am I doing screen sharing or someone in Stockton operating the slideshow?
Screen share.
Okay, let me do that. Okay, is my slide on the screen in all sites and online? Are we okay?
This is Connie on Zoom, and it looks clear to me.
Okay, are we okay in the boardroom in Stockton?
We're good here.
Okay, very good. Okay, great. Well, thank you again, Connie. And I apologize for my slide. You are a committee, not a commission, but the law and the principles still apply to you. So I'm going to cover sort of two major areas. One is sort of an overview of the criteria you'll be dealing with, including federal requirements and the Fair Maps Act requirements that you're familiar with already. And then we'll cover more specifically communities of interest strategies. And again, I certainly want to compliment both the committee and redistricting partners. The website looks really great. I think you're really ahead of the game in terms of a lot of the questions you're thinking about and getting ready for your public hearing. So I congratulate you on your progress so far. So just as an overview, we're going to cover again the federal and state requirements under the Fair Maps Act. Talk about how the priorities are set and how you might think about implementing as you're going forward with gathering all this information about the county and various communities in the county that may deserve some protection in the process. And there are a lot of different ways to gather communities of interest. We'll talk about some of which you've already started in terms of getting forums together and developing questions and avenues for people to participate, but also some somewhat thorny questions that involve defining communities of interest and how you can look at different kinds of data from different angles and how they can all come together as you're preparing your maps for later this year. Okay, so just as a basic listing of some of the sources of law that you're going to have to be dealing with. There are federal constitutional guidelines that are or laws that are in place. The Federal Voting Rights Act is a critical one, particularly in protecting racial and language minorities in the county. The state law that is most applicable to you is in the Elections Code, the Fair Maps Act. That covers both the federal requirements, but also enumerates some ranked criteria. And it's very important to remember the rankings and order of priorities. It's certainly helpful when you're actually drawing the map, and it'll help you in resolving potential conflicts as you're moving forward. But it's also important to understand the rankings because the public may not always prioritize or see what is important to them as aligning with what you have to do as a committee and how you recommend maps to the board, because you have particular laws that you're bound to follow. But the public, can often, prioritize things like compactness or maybe want to keep city boundaries more intact than, say, communities of interest, or may not quite understand why the Voting Rights Act is so important relative to local geography. So all those things are important to keep in mind as you're going through the process. I'm not going to cover today things related to timelines, hearings, outreach, et cetera. Again, there's sort of within the Fair Maps Act, there are minimums that are needed for things like the website and for public hearings. Timelines are a little bit in flux because of the delays in the census data. There may be some legislation being passed by the states that might extend some of the timelines for final maps. So something certainly your council should keep apprised of as things are moving forward. The state commission is going to try to get their deadlines extended to mid-January. That was something that developed last night at their most recent hearing, or meeting. So again, things to think about, but we're going to focus today on the criteria specifically. Okay, so federal requirements. As you know, there are some very basic population equality requirements that come out of the 14th Amendment. Not too hard to figure out, but there are some guidelines in terms of the amount of deviation you can have from perfect equality and what the standards are. There are some important anti-discrimination provisions in the 14th Amendment that deal with race-based redistricting or race-conscious redistricting. So we'll talk a little bit about that. I want to mention the 15th Amendment in tandem with the Voting Rights Act, because both of those laws apply to racial discrimination. One thing to note is that the 15th Amendment applies to intentional discrimination. So if you intentionally divide or pack into a single district too many minority citizens or residents, that can be a problem. That might be unconstitutional. And then the Voting Rights Act covers both intentional and non-intentional discrimination. Okay, so population equality. Unlike the congressional districting, where the state commission will be drawing districts that have to be pretty much absolutely equal in population, at the local level, counties and cities and school boards don't have to be that precise. Typically, there's a guideline that suggests that you can keep within 10% deviation, and I'll talk about that on the next slide, what that calculation means, but you get a fair amount of leeway in terms of the equality of the population size of each district. You don't have to be absolutely exact, but if you go too far, you may have to have some very good reasons for doing so. One thing to note in the state law is that you have to count total population in terms of equality. You don't take subsets like just citizens or just adult citizens or just the voters. Okay. You are dependent on what will be produced by the statewide database from the, again, delayed census data. There will be mandatory adjustments to prisoner populations because state law requires, as much as possible, the reallocation of prisoners to their last known home addresses. So that's something that will come about, but again, nothing that you have to worry about specifically, since that'll come out as part of the basic database that should be working. Okay, as I mentioned before, the deviation has to be generally under 10%, and the one important thing, you don't have to do those calculations. Your consultants will do that. It'll be a running tally that's kept in the software. You just need to know that, again, you're drawing 5 supervisorial districts. The county is probably going to be somewhere between 750 to 800, or maybe a little more than 800,000 people under the 2020 census. So your ideal district size is probably going to be somewhere between 150, 160, 165,000. And you just have to sort of be mindful of the fact that you look at the smallest district and the largest district, look at the difference there, and then just kind of figure out how, as a percentage, that is spread is over the ideal district size. But again, this is something that the software will keep account of as you're drawing districts. Again, you can go above this figure, but you need to have some good reasons. So it may be, say, for example, to comply with the Voting Rights Act, or there may be some state criterion that's really important that you have to maintain, where there might be some need to go above 10%. Definitely want to check in with your lawyers about doing that, that there could be some legal issues if you go above. You can certainly go below. Whether you want to set a threshold or a figure below 10%, I think it's better to leave that open-ended and just see how you're doing with the criteria and applying them. So I would caution against setting too low a target, but you can certainly think about that as you're moving forward. Okay, 14th Amendment also has some prohibitions on what's called racial gerrymandering. This has to be considered in tandem with the Voting Rights Act, because you can consider, and under the Voting Rights Act, you really have to consider racial characteristics of the population. But if you use race too strongly, what's known in the law as a predominant factor test, or if the districts are really very strangely shaped in order to accommodate racial populations or racial minority populations, that could trigger some problems in terms of the constitutionality of the districts. If you're using the Voting Rights Act to justify particular districts, that can be a defense against this. If you're going to be thinking about race-based communities of interest, you have to be very careful to make sure that race is not the only factor and is not the predominant factor when you're considering the shape of the district, because there may be certainly other factors that come into play, but if you start using race as the only thing, you could come into some problems with the 14th Amendment. Okay, again, I mentioned the 15th Amendment, and this is simply a good way to introduce a very fundamental set of concepts when you're dealing with districting, and that is a problem of packing and the problem of fracking. These are basically sort of two sides of the same coin. Packing is when you over-concentrate a population in order to dilute its voting strength. Fracking is dividing a population among two or more districts. It doesn't necessarily apply just to minority groups. You can pack or crack any particular population. It's not unusual, for example, in many states to pack or crack along party lines. That's a fairly common phenomenon. Not necessarily unconstitutional, at least under the federal law, but not something you're gonna have to worry about too much, but in the context of minority vote dilution, something to be aware of. And if you do it intentionally, that could be a constitutional problem. Just an example here, again, if you put too many voters into a particular district to, in essence, waste the voting strength of that population, that could be packing. If you split them among a couple districts, that's an example of cracking. Okay, so the Federal Voting Rights Act, or the VRA. You know, there used to be an applicable provision to a couple counties in California known as Section 5. That's no longer applicable this cycle. You know, there may be some legislation. It's unlikely to pass, but it's probably not going to be a case that you have to worry about for this particular cycle. But Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which is a general anti-discrimination provision, does apply to San Joaquin County as well as the rest of California and the country. So let's go through a couple points related to this law. And again, after population equality and some other constitutional considerations, VRA compliance is your next highest criterion. And if you make a determination that you need to draw a majority minority district, or at least it's a consideration in your development of districts, you need to pay very close attention to the case law and to how you're doing analyses of the districts that you might be drawing. So let's cover a couple points here. The VRA is a little bit different from other anti-discrimination laws because it covers both racial minorities and what are known as language minorities. This is a way of sort of making sure that Latinos, Asians, and Native Americans are included in the language of the statute, but it is in essence an anti-discrimination law like other laws. You can violate the act by intentionally packing or cracking populations, but the case law that has evolved since the 1980s has also allowed for litigation against localities like San Joaquin County if you do not draw majority minority districts where they might be drawn to provide opportunities for minority populations to elect candidates of choice. So as you're drawing your districts, you need to look at the demographics of your districts carefully. If you feel there may be some majority minority districts that could be drawn, you may want to, and I'd recommend engaging in a little bit of a deeper electoral analysis to look at what will, I'll just describe in a few moments as polarized voting among racial and ethnic groups. The thing to note here is that you are, in essence, thinking about whether you're going to get sued under Section 2. There are no affirmative requirements that you draw particular districts, but you could be subject to litigation, either by the government, federal government, or by private plaintiffs if the districts, in fact, dilute, like by not drawing effective majority-minority districts. So it's not something you can necessarily predict, but either through testimony or some element of input you get from maybe civil rights organizations or from members of the public generally, you may get this flagged as an important issue. And you certainly want to do a demographic scan before you engage in your line drawing. Okay, so there is a major case called Thornburg versus Jingles, and there's a 3-factor test. They're sometimes called the Jingles factors. And these are important because you need to sort of look at your county and look at potential issues that might come up because you have very large minority populations. So the Jingles factors focus on, one, whether there's a large and compact minority population that could be in a district, and you have to look at the numbers to see how a potential district could be drawn and what the population of the minority group is. But generally, you're looking at a population that's over 50% of the citizen voting age population, CVAP data. And that's something you can't access now. You don't have to wait for the 2020 census data to come out. The set that ends in 2019 is available currently. You also have to look at whether the minority group itself votes cohesively, and whether non-minority group members, it's often called white bloc voting, but because we're dealing with a multi-ethnic set of communities in California, that it could be simply, they may include other minority groups, but you have to compare the minority group that's under question with other voters to see if there is polarized voting. So one group votes together, and other voters tend to vote against that particular group's candidates. Okay, and the term is racially polarized voting. Okay, so those are the main inquiries. There are some additional requirements under the Voting Rights Act and Thornburg versus Jingles, but known as the totality of circumstances, and that's a deeper dive into an analysis of past discrimination and election history in the county. But the first thing you ought to be thinking about is, do we have large enough populations of groups that we need to at least flag this issue? If you're not dealing with a significant enough population, or there's some issues around how spread out they are or how concentrated they are, this may not simply come up as a Section 2 problem, but it's certainly something you want to do in terms of looking at your data fairly soon to determine whether you need to do a deeper dive into the electoral history. Okay, a couple points here. If you do this analysis, and I suggest you at least do some basic demographic analysis of the population data, you need to decide if you want to get specialized counsel. If you think that there might be some very live issues for the county, then do you want to invest in getting some demographic analyses done, racially polarized voting? Obviously, you don't have an unlimited budget, so you have to figure out if this is something that could even be accommodated with what you're able to do. But if you really want to dot your I's and cross your T's, because there is a significant enough population or set of populations, you might want to invest in getting some counsel on this set of issues. One other thing, a couple other points, particularly with Latino and Asian American populations, when you're looking at the numbers, as you're moving forward and you're trying to actually draw districts, you have to think about whether You need to go above 50% to create a district that will provide sufficient opportunities for these populations because of the higher percentage of immigrants and non-citizens in these communities. That may be that the population has to be a little further above 50%, like 55%, up to 60%. Again, this is a legal question. You'd certainly want to talk to your counsel about adjusting those numbers upward if you need to. Coalition districts, if you have multiple minority groups, that certainly is something you want to maybe take a look at as you're doing a demographic analysis. Do you have a sense that particular populations, say Asian or Latino or Black and Latino, or any sort of combinations might be a voting bloc that needs protection under the Voting Rights Act? I don't know enough about the local politics of the county or some of the larger cities, but this is not unusual. It's not common a lawsuit, but increasingly redistricting bodies are looking at this question to at least cover all bases. Last point, as a redistricting body, if you don't see large enough populations to cover a majority minority district or create a majority minority district, you can create, as a redistricting body, what are called influence districts. You're not mandated to do this under the Voting Rights Act. It's not a litigable claim at this point. When you get down to say 30, 35 or 40% of the potential district, but you can draw those districts, and it's not necessarily the Voting Rights Act that is compelling you to do that. It may be because you find that there are communities of interest, or maybe neighborhoods. So other criteria that are listed in the Fair Maps Act might be a basis for drawing what are called influence districts. But again, you have to be mindful of some constraints in terms of what pulls a community of interest together and how you factor race into the total equation. Okay. Are there any, just at this point, are there any questions just about some of the federal mandates?
Any questions from people here in the room or on online? Nothing online? Okay, continue on.
Very good. So, if you didn't have the Fair Maps Act, you'd still have to apply the federal Constitution, you'd still have to apply the Voting Rights Act. The Fair Maps Act is a pretty new law, which was not in effect the last cycle for local government. So there are now ranked criteria. These are similar to what the State Commission did in 2011, but there are some nuances that are particular to counties as well as to cities. And you're not a charter county, so you don't have any sort of extra gloss that's put on your redistricting process, but the state law does have a lot of specific requirements. So we'll go through each of these. And again, the ranking is important. So contiguous districts, contiguity, that outranks trying to preserve neighborhoods and communities of interest, which in turn outranks cities and census designated places. And as you go on further down the line, the rankings become less important. So, if push comes to shove, the higher ranked criteria will always trump the lower ones. Okay. And at the bottom, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, you are not to basically look at partisanship or party membership in order to favor any one party or discriminate against any party. Okay. So let's go through each one. I think this has probably been covered in some previous sessions, but I will just reinforce some points here. So contiguity is basically making sure that a district is all together, right? It's not sort of jumping around. It's not just sort of creating some oddly shaped districts that are created that are joined at different points. At a lot of local jurisdictions, you may have some jumping around simply because that's the boundaries of cities. A lot of annexations may occur in municipal government. So it's not unusual to see a little bit of jumping around in terms of official boundaries, but contiguity is really a way of trying to remedy some of the gerrymandering that can occur in a lot of cycles. Okay, and again, a simple example here where number 2, contiguous district, number 1 that sort of jumps around. Now again, maybe there's some natural boundaries there with some ordinary municipal boundaries, that's something you have to kind of work with depending on your local circumstances. Okay, neighborhoods and communities of interest. Again, we're going to cover communities of interest in more depth after we go through all the criteria, but local neighborhoods, local communities of interest are high ranked, and they are higher ranked than cities and census designated places. So that's really important to keep in mind. Communities of interest cannot be based on relationships with parties, candidates, or incumbents. Okay, so that's important. You may hear people talking about, well, I really like my current district. And that's okay, but remember, when you say current district, that may be another way of saying I like the incumbent, right? Now, again, the public can say whatever they want to. If they like the incumbent, they like the current district, great. But you have to be careful about creating a community of interest that may be based on incumbency. It may be based on something else that keeps a current district, closely intact, but you certainly don't want to mention or talk about parties or incumbents or candidacies as the basis for a community of interest. Okay. Neighborhoods is a topic or a criterion where you may have some specific boundaries. It's not unusual for larger cities, and I don't know enough about Stockton to say whether there's, if there are official boundaries, but some larger cities have official neighborhoods, or at least what are commonly understood as neighborhood boundaries. You can, if you want to, rely on other sources like real estate designations, or maybe historic or other kinds of boundaries that are well known in the community. But you're not necessarily bound by those, but they can be helpful as you're looking at whether you want to keep something intact. It's probably better, and as much as possible, to think of neighborhoods in tandem with communities of interest, so that you get some public input and you get a better sense from members of the public that these are their neighborhoods or these are their communities that they want to keep together. Neighborhoods, unlike communities of interest, is just in terms of commonsensical approaches, typically smaller units, something that people kind of have a better sense of. I can walk around my neighborhood. I know sort of the local economy or the local community centers, those kinds of things. So tend to be less controversial than communities of interest, but can still be a little bit fuzzy depending on how people might differ about what the boundaries actually are. So it's something to consider as you're doing community of interest input. Okay, again, we're going to cover these in more depth, but typical examples of the interests that can tie communities or tie a community together. Urban versus rural. Obviously, San Joaquin County is dealing with a lot of very different communities in terms of sort of agricultural versus urban mixes. So that's something you're going to have to be working with a lot over the next few months. You might have folks that have different income levels, different property ownership or rent versus renter interests. There may be geographic differences, lakes, mountains, rivers. Transportation can often be a basis for community of interest. And again, you can have sort of racial or ethnic communities. We'll come back again to some of the more challenging questions on this topic. Okay, so the next criterion, cities and census designated places. This is the area that's less controversial, simply because you have official city boundaries, and the Census Bureau will give you census designated places. And those are often how people define their communities or neighborhoods. They often parallel how the federal government has defined and enumerated the CDPs. But you have to keep, as much as possible, those intact. You do have have at least one city that's pretty large. So Stockton is going to be too big to keep within one district. It's possible you might be able to keep it in two districts, but larger cities do have to be split. So you can't avoid that in order to comply with the federal population requirements. CDPs, again, this is something the Census Bureau is going to give you a listing of. There's some, obviously some well-known areas that you know of. I've listed a couple here, French Camp, Country Club, etc. A number of them are in the county. Just as a reminder, the state criteria treat all of the major sort of geographic and urban areas as equal. County guidelines are different. Again, neighborhoods are the same as communities of interest. So if you have to reconcile those types of boundaries, they're equal. So you have to figure out how to reconcile between equal categories, but they outrank cities and CDPs. Cities and
Excuse me.
CDPs. Yes.
We have the screen is dark.
Okay.
AV man is on it right now.
Okay. Did it, how far or how long has it been dark? I need to go back.
Just went dark.
Okay.
And on the Zoom, the screen is still visible.
Okay. We'll just wait for the folks in the room to get that back. Any
rank
questions?
criteria.
Oh, are we okay?
Yeah, you're back up. You're
Okay,
good.
good. Okay.
Wait a minute. Would you please go back and explain that slide that you were just about to leave, but it's all black now for us anyway? Excuse me, this is Pam Ibeck, Vice Chair.
Okay, so you don't have it right now? Well, okay, I can talk since it's not that visually it's not that exciting. So again, the rankings of the criteria keep local neighborhoods and local communities of interest at the same level. So if there are differences or conflicts that might exist in those categories, you have to figure out how to do that. And the same goes for cities and CDPs. Those are equal in terms of ranking. And if there are conflicts, you have to reconcile them. But neighborhoods and communities of interest outrank cities and CDPs. So if someone says, well, my community of interest is, part of it's in Stockton, part of it is in, just outside the boundaries of Stockton. And again, I don't know if to name a suburb, but let's just say that it goes outside of an official city boundary. As you're going through some decision-making about what to prioritize, that community of interest, if you so recognize it as one that transcends a city boundary, might be something that you have to keep intact over trying to maintain Stockton's integrity. Okay. Now, again, this is an example. Some of these may not come up, or it might get even more complicated because you've got a whole bunch of other criteria coming in, and you have to make some judgments about what do you think are prioritized. But the law certainly ranks certain types of communities above others, or criteria over others. But you may face some challenges within the same ranking. How are we on visual in Stockton?
We're doing good.
Okay. Hopefully it's still good. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And again, if something comes up, just shout it out. So identifiable boundaries. This is the next rank criterion, and this is fairly easy to understand. It's just streets, barriers that come up, freeways, highways, things like railroad tracks. You may have rivers or other kinds of natural geographic barriers. Fairly intuitive, this end. Now, again, it's a lower rank criterion, so someone might want to say, well, we have nothing to do with the folks on the other side of the freeway, but that has to fit in with all the other criteria as well. But it's not, it's a little more intuitive compared to some of the other criteria. Okay. Last ranked one is compactness, and I think Paul Mitchell probably covered this a little bit more in your previous session. The definition of compactness is a little more intuitive in saying don't jump over closer populations for ones that are further away. There are mathematical or algorithmic variations on this kind of test, but it's one thing to just rely on the computer to do it, or rather than just looking at it. And eyeball testing is perfectly good in terms of determining whether your district is complying with this criteria. Okay, you can kind of get a sense. Oh well, we kind of moved too far over here. Let's try to tighten this up a little bit and keep the district more compact. So it's fairly easy to apply. One thing to note is that a lot of folks tend to just intuitively treat compactness or just look at the shape of the district and trying to keep it sort of aesthetically appealing. They tend to prioritize that over other things that you have to think about, including population equality. So you often have to remind them that, you know, compactness is a lower ranking criteria. We're trying to keep things as compact as possible, but in order to accomplish some other goals with the other criteria, we have to draw the lines a certain way, and they may not be as you know, as attractive or as compact as we would like them to be. Okay, again, prohibited criterion, party favoritism or discrimination is not allowed. Now note that incumbency is not mentioned here. You know, how you want to think about incumbency is something you have to talk about. At the state level, it is specifically prohibited. It is not prohibited, at least in this part of the statute. It is not, incumbency is not allowed as a community of interest basis, but you know, how it factors in is, it's not specified, so you have to think about that. And obviously the board itself will be looking at the district, so that may come into play there. But you know, you will often hear a lot of members of the public saying, you know, I like my district, and honestly nothing wrong with that kind of comment, but you have to be, you know, mindful of the fact that may be a way of advocating for a particular candidate or an incumbent board member. Okay, so again, just a couple general points about looking at these criteria. Again, understand the ranking, make sure that the public knows how the rankings are set out. It helps a lot when you're getting testimony to at least make sure they understand that, so they don't, you know, over prioritize other criteria that are lower ranked. VRA compliance, again, I would suggest just doing some preliminary demographic analysis to see if the VRA is something you have to really pay attention to. If you don't, then you can just keep moving on with the normal course of things. But if you do have, again, sizable minority populations, combinations of minority groups, you definitely want to take a look at some of the demographics and maybe doing a deeper dive into some of the electoral analysis. Again, as I mentioned, you may be dealing with some challenges in terms of conflicting or maybe overlapping communities of interest, and you've got to develop some internal guidelines on how you're going to reconcile some of these issues or some of these differences if they do come up. You know, if you're lucky, you know, there'll be a lot of agreement, a lot of consensus, but typically there's going to be some you know, differences of opinion about boundaries, and maybe, you know, just overlapping districts or overlapping communities can be a problem as well. Last point, you can, as you're looking at the district lines themselves, you can use some of these communities of interest, these neighborhoods, as sort of building blocks. But be aware of the fact that a lot of the testimony will suggest that you know, there's a community of interest or a neighborhood here, but we don't think we should be put in the same district as, you know, X or Y neighborhood because we don't have that much in common with them. And you'll have to make a determination about whether that's correct. But you know, you certainly.
We just went black again.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll just mention again that you can use these as building blocks, but again, they may present conflicts between neighborhoods, or maybe ways of finding commonalities that suggest you can build up to an entire district.
Staff was working on it right now.
Yeah, so I'm going to jump into communities of interest next. Any points that you'd like me to reinforce, or any questions?
Are there any questions from anyone that's on the chat or line here in the room? No, sir.
Okay.
Just waiting for staff to get it back up. There it is. It's partially there. There you are.
Okay, so we're now we're going to talk about a little more about communities of interest. And you know, you've gotten you know, you've already made a fair amount of progress with some of the online forums and thinking about your you know, avenues for doing education to the public. And communities of interest is one of the criteria that it's it's absolutely imperative that you get public input, because it's not a a very well-defined concept in redistricting, but it's an important one. And obviously, as we've seen with the rankings, it's way up there in terms of things you have to consider. But there's a lot of fuzziness about what actually is a community, what might be an interest in uniting that community, and then boundaries can vary quite a bit based on people's perceptions. So it's a challenging concept. So again, it's tied to public participation. You're operating in a county level governmental setting, so you want to make sure that as people are defining interest, that it has some relevance to county government. Because there's a lot of layers of redistricting happening, people may be thinking about, well, I'm thinking about my congressional district, my community is based on this thing, this interest, but it might be that the interest they're defining is actually more of a federal interest rather than a local one. So you have to make sure that, at least in terms of how you're considering maintaining communities of interest, that they have some connection to the level of government that you're dealing with. Again, you're getting a good start on things. The census data set is probably not going to be ready for you to use until sometime in the mid to late September. So this is a good time to get a lot of that community of interest data together. We've talked about building blocks, and there may be some distinctions and bases for creating boundaries from the information you get on communities of interest testimony. And again, it fits in with a number of other criteria, and it may be something that ties in with how you're looking at VRA compliance or how you're looking at population equality. And it's certainly important to keep all those criteria in mind as you're looking at communities of interest. Okay. Now, again, just keep putting up the same slide, but a couple important points here, which is that you're dealing with local neighborhoods, local communities of interest. They have to be tied together by some common social or economic interest, and it's important to have that articulated. And it has to be tied in with a sense of representation. That is, it has to do something with what's happening at the county level. But that can be pretty broad, because county government does a lot of different things. But certainly you want to draw some distinctions between what may be a federal policy question or something that might be very specific to a city. So think about is this something that the county can actually deal with as an interest that needs to be represented. And again, we've got some proscribed bases for communities of interest. Okay, so again, locality is important. One thing you have to be mindful of is that people don't always think that locally. So I think I heard some earlier discussion about agricultural interests. That could be very broad, right? That could cover much of your county, right? So you have to make sure that that community of interest is something that can be defined, and you can find boundaries that might fit within one or maybe two districts. But if it's something that covers all 5 districts, that's not that helpful, because you have to draw lines that protect communities of interest. And if they cover the 80-90% of the county, then that's not really local, right? That's very broad. So you have to be careful about using information or being able to apply information that is local enough to make sense with the districts you're going to draw. Now, again, the public or members of the public may have a broader sense of what local means, and you can sort of push them to try to keep it as local as possible, but sometimes you don't get that much help with the breadth of a community. But as much as possible, you should be defining and delineating communities of interest that are localized. Okay, they don't have to be contiguous, they don't have to be compact, but again, you should be mindful of how well they can fit within a particular district. Okay. One last point here is that you might have a community of interest that starts in your county and it may extend into an adjacent county. That's perfectly okay, but again, you can only do or only recognize that part of the community of interest that is in San Joaquin County. Okay, you can, there may be a very strong agricultural worker interest, for example, that goes into an adjacent county, but keep it within your own district boundaries. Okay, So what are common social or economic interests? The Fair Maps Act doesn't really list too many. The California state law has a few examples. I've listed or I've quoted language from the Colorado Constitution, and I only do it simply because it's fairly recent in terms of its adoption, and it has a lot of examples, but it's not exclusive in terms of the types of communities that could come into play. But you can see from looking at the listings, there's a whole bunch of different ways you can cut an interest. So it could be urban, rural, agricultural, trade, manufacturing, any number of policy issues, as you can see, education, employment, et cetera. And as we've talked about before, there may be racial, ethnic, or language minority groups that comprise a community of interest. It might be based on racial status, language, cultural commonalities. All of these can be potential communities of interest. Now, if you're doing your outreach, it's up to you to decide how tightly you want to define or provide examples. You can list a lot of examples. You certainly want to make sure that it's a non-exclusive list, or you can keep it more general if you want to. The public, wants help typically, but if you want to keep it open-ended and just let people come in with their conceptions of what might be a viable community, then that's certainly an option you can pursue. But as you get down to actually drawing districts, you want to have as much specific information about boundaries and rationales for communities of interest to help you actually tighten up those lines as you're putting them together. Okay. As you're thinking about the level of government, again, county government, remember, counties are creations of the state, right? They don't have sort of a separate existence. They're designed, they're subdivisions of the state, and they're designed to implement state policy. But certainly, obviously, a lot happens at the board level. But there's a wide range of issues that you're dealing with at the county level. Criminal and civil justice, agricultural issues, property, healthcare, different kinds of services, a lot of environmental or land use or waste management questions. And these are partial list of things that the board and county government are involved in. Always helpful to think about, well, is the community that's being asserted here, relevant to this level of government, right? Now, as an example, if someone comes in and says, well, we're really concerned about taxes, right? We think we have a community here that's really adversely affected by federal income tax, right? Well, federal income tax is federal income tax, right? So that's not something that the state or the county is really engaged in, but there are other kinds of taxation, particularly property taxation, where a community might say, well, we're paying an awful lot in property taxes, and I think you can identify our particular neighborhood as one that's not necessarily getting its fair shake when it comes to property tax assessment. So that is different from, say, federal taxation. So there's a connection there between the interest and the county government and how those interests are represented at the county level. Okay, so here's an example, and again, this is just one example of a community of interest. There will be many more as you listen to the public. So one might be a set of neighborhoods or some residential areas that are near an airport. So there's sort of a geographically defining characteristic, that is you're close to an airport. There may be relatively clear boundaries in terms of what constitutes being near that airport. There might be some common policy issues related to noise, traffic, zoning issues. A lot of times when you're closer to an airport, the property values are lower. There may be higher percentages of renters. The income levels may be closely aligned in that kind of neighborhood or that area. So there's a lot going on there that could say, well, maybe this is something that ought to be kept together, because at the county level, particularly if it's a county airport or it's something that the county has a fair amount of responsibility over, that is something that unites this particular area. And that's something that maybe we have to think about as we're drawing the district and keeping that community together, because they have a lot of common issues. Okay. Just a couple more points related to racial and ethnic communities of interest. You may have assertions of communities of interest that involve smaller populations. You might have communities of interest that are not, because there isn't specific coverage under the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act is a little bit different from other statutes because it doesn't protect non-minority, or let's say, outside of the listed minority groups, which are, again, racial groups or language minority groups. There are groups, for example, Arab Americans, folks of European descent, who might feel that they have a very clearly defined community and a clear geographic neighborhood or set of boundaries, but they're not really covered by the VRA, yet they can constitute maybe an ethnic or culturally based community of interest, and they would like to stay in the same neighborhood, right? So a good example might be from another part of the state might be, an Arab American community in parts of Southern California, or an Armenian community in parts of the Glendale area of Los Angeles County, where you have not a group that's protected by the VRA, but nonetheless asserts a common set of interests that might revolve around ethnicity, but have some relevance to local government. So that may be a basis for a potential community of interest. Again, a reminder: be careful about just using race or ethnicity. If you are going to consider race or ethnicity, make sure you can also say there's something else going on. There's some geographic factors, some demographic characteristics in addition to race or ethnicity that suggests that this community ought to be kept intact. Okay. Be careful if you hear testimony saying, well, we're gonna, our community covers a whole bunch of areas. We have, parts of it is in Stockton, parts of it in southern part of the county. It kind of jumps around a little bit, but it's still a community that has a lot in common. Okay. Be careful about that because, again, while there aren't legal requirements that the community of interest be contiguous or compact, you could come into conflict with the Constitution because you're drawing oddly shaped districts on the basis of predominantly race or ethnicity, and it's not as together in terms of geographic space as you would expect it to be. So watch out for folks who are saying, well, we have a bunch of different communities in different parts of the county, keep it all together in a single district. You might have, you might keep those communities intact in multiple districts, but be careful about sort of trying to spread your district around just to accommodate that particular population. Okay, so a couple things, and we've talked about them before. Again, you can decide how, in terms of the public's participation and your own decision-making about what constitutes a community of interest, how do you want to keep it open-ended? Do you want to sort of list a lot of examples? I think it's better to give examples, but to keep an open mind about things and just let people come in with their definition and their senses of what constitutes their community, and then assess it as you're developing communities or community visualizations, and maybe as you're developing maps. Okay. Again, try to make sure that the public understands you have to keep it local, that they have to fit within a district or maybe two districts. Don't try to define a community of interest that spreads across multiple areas of the county. It's just too hard to work with and doesn't help you with actually drawing lines typically. We've talked about the rankings, again, within one line versus another, and potential conflicts between the criteria. There's no easy way to do that. You have to figure out, well, we're trying to exercise our best judgment here and trying to reconcile multiple interests. But at some point you have to say, well, we have to make a call here, and we have to draw a line someplace. So sometimes you might have to divide a neighborhood or a community of interest, even though folks will be unhappy, but you have to draw those lines someplace. Okay. Again, you are relying largely on public commentary, which comes in through various forms, maps, testimony, written submissions. One thing I would suggest as a way of sort of both as a backup to the public commentary is at least developing some sense of what's going on demographically within the county. And this is where you can look at both the 2020 census data once it's out, as well as existing data sets, the ACS data, American Community Survey, ACS data set. There may be some county data or state level data that you can access. This is helpful just to get a sense of what's going on in the county, and it can help verify some of the assertions that are made by the public. There may be gaps in the information, so it's good to have in front of you as you're doing some mapping, some of the demographics, so you can get a sense of where, well, are there economic commonalities? Are there social or the racial or ethnic commonalities? Is that borne out by not only by the testimony, but also by how we look at some of the most recent data? There are a lot of statistical or some suggestions that have come out of different, from redistricting experts and academics about other ways of looking at communities of interest, sort of doing statistical analyses, clustering different kinds of demographic characteristics. One thing I've mentioned here, but it's certainly something that hasn't been explored too much, but it could, if you're inclined to look at some of the kinds of data. You can look at ballot initiative data, which is not considered partisan. It's not tied to candidacies. It's tied to issues. Maybe that can give you some sense of where there are some patterns within the county. If you're dealing with, let's say you're dealing with an issue revolving around, let's say, rent control. You're dealing with an issue around property taxes that came up as a ballot issue. That might be a way of kind of getting a handle on some differences and geographic differences that might exist within the county that could be, potential communities of interest. Again, you have to, devote the resources to maybe exploring that, but that's another source of information that could be helpful to you. Okay. Again, we've talked about this already. Ideally, you'll get a good, you get a good sampling of information from all over the county, but you might have, parts of the county that aren't terribly responsive. You as committee members are sort of drawn from existing districts, so a number of you are sort of like, well, that's my district. I'm one who sort of knows that better than some of the other members of the committee. But typically, a lot about your own community. I'm sure all of you know a lot about the county at certain levels, but there may be things you don't know about, some corners of different cities, or just areas you haven't explored on your own. So be aware of the fact that you may have gaps in what the public tells you. You may have gaps in your own knowledge as a committee itself. So try to find ways where you can fill those gaps, either additional outreach or just trying to look at other kinds of data that might be helpful. Inconsistent information. Again, you may have folks who give you different boundaries for where a community of interest or neighborhood starts and ends. You have to make those calls about whether you want to get it more broadly or more narrowly. Hopefully you'll get multiple sources, and there'll be some reinforcement of different opinions as you're moving forward. Now, there is an issue which can always come up, which is that if you have folks who are being active, and this is just the nature of the democratic process, but if they come in there with a lot of testimony around a common area, or there's form letters, other kinds of mobilization, you may find yourself flooded by a lot of stuff, and you have to consider, well, we get that it's okay to do that because that's part of the democratic process, but how do we use that information? How do we deal with information that might come in through form letters or through mobilization of individuals at hearings, and how much do we weigh that in the big picture? You can get some very helpful information from a single individual because you don't get anything from anybody else. You might get 1,000 form letters, and how do we, you don't want to say, well, we'll multiply that by 1,000 to make a decision about whether to keep it intact. Well, it's worth something that people mobilize, and that a number of people care about a community, but how do you allocate your weight as you're drawing your lines? Those are problems. Final point here is that this happened at the state level, where there might have been partisan interest or incumbent interest that were sort of pushing for particular communities of interest or for particular district lines. When it comes to public input, that's not illegal. It may be illegal for you to draw lines in that way, but the public can say whatever it wants to. You can choose to ignore it. But sometimes you have to maybe dig a little bit deeper when you're looking at how folks are portraying the information. Is it something that might be really partisans or folks who are pushing for incumbents as a basis for creating or recognize a community of interest? And it might be a perfectly legitimate one. It might be one that's designed to help somebody who's already in office. You have to make that sort of call in terms of whether it's something to look into more deeply. Okay. Some really quick things, and again, I think Redistricting Partners is certainly working very closely with you in terms of different elements of your input and how you're processing information. There are mandates in terms of providing outreach. You've got a very good website. You want to make sure that in terms of your hearings, there's disability access, languages. You've got a number of your materials translated already. Again, my suggestion is that you keep input as open as possible. Recommend guidelines. Make the criteria clear. Make it clear to the public what you think might be ideal forms of information. Ideal is a description, a reason for a community being kept together. A good set of boundaries is very helpful. It's nice to have lines that you can rely on. But folks may not come in with that information. You have to be open to just sort of taking it in. To the extent you can create a dialogue, you might suggest, well, can you help us out here with giving us some boundaries? But if they don't, just take it and weigh it as best you can. You have a certain number of hearings. You can certainly exceed the minimums required by the Fair Maps Act. It's a fairly low number. It's only 4, and just 1 before you produce a draft, at least 1 before the draft, and at least 2 afterwards. But you can certainly exceed that if you want to. And it's good to again spread it around and look at the different districts and look at potential low participation areas and see if you can get some of the work out there, both in terms of outreach materials as well as maybe potentially having a hearing out there. And you've got an online forum already. I did list the California one. I think the language that you're using is similar to what's on the California, the statewide databases community of interest form. And I think you're going to be, my understanding is you're going to be using Districtor or District R, the online tool, as part of your process. The form you're currently using on the website, I think, doesn't let you draw a map unless it can maybe take a file and be attached to it. But you want to make sure as much as possible that you're able to get some geographic information. So the technical term is a shaped file, but it doesn't have to be a computer-ready form. It can certainly be a hand-drawn map or just a line on a paper map is very helpful. You have to convert that into a shape file. But in terms of actually articulating a community, hand-drawn maps are very helpful, just as much as computer-generated ones can be. Just a word about the online tools. They can be very powerful. They're really helpful in terms of getting specific boundaries and looking at demographic information, not only for folks to draw communities of interest, but also actually draw district maps. They can give you a full-blown map if they want to. But understand that not everybody wants to work with that kind of medium. So if somebody just photocopies a map and draws some lines on it, that's great stuff too. But again, the online tools are very helpful. They're very powerful. They can be very useful as you're putting all the districts together. Okay, last couple things, and this is more for your processing of the information. Very important to catalog all of these sources of public input. There may be folks who want to take a look at that and maybe make comparisons, or maybe they want to draw maps in terms of your accountability to the public. Great to have a good catalog of the districts. To the extent you might have geographic information, shape files, actual maps, to have those available on your website for folks to look at. Mapping decisions, again, this is where you have to kind of think about, well, how are we going to deal with all this different testimony? Depending on how active residents of your county are, you might get a lot of information. You might get too much from one part and too little from another part. So you have to kind of figure out how you can get a good sampling of information throughout the county, and how do you weigh things like those folks who aren't really working with any group or any folks who are mobilizing people. You may have groups within your county who are working at a community level, or might be, part of a statewide organization that are doing things like, VRA advocacy. You certainly want to take a serious look at some of those maps, but it's all part of a broad set of a broad collection of information that you have to kind of figure out how much you're going to weigh together. One problem which you have to be careful about is, and this is not going to be as much of an issue if you're really systematic about compiling your data and making sure that it's in a good form, is be careful as you're going through the process of actually drawing a map that you don't end up cherry picking a lot of community of interest information. Okay, you want to try to look at the community of interest, the neighborhood, the city, and the CDP information. Take a good hard look at that and try as much as possible to sort of figure that out before you actually start drawing the districts themselves, because it's very easy to sort of start with a conception of what a district will look like, and then you kind of go back and say, oh, well, I heard some community of interest information about that. So you go back after the fact and say, well, there's something in the record that can justify this district. Well, that's not illegal, but it may not be as systematic, because there's probably something in the record that will justify some part of a district. And you want to say, well, we need to think about, well, how many people participated? What's the nature of the information that we got? Is it in fact reflective of a community of interest, or can we keep communities of interest together in a certain way that is justified by public participation? So one thing you need to think about, this is simply a suggestion, and you want to check in with redistricting partners about this, is you might want to try to map out in draft form some of the communities of interest, some of the neighborhoods in advance of the actual district lines being drawn. So that's helpful for a number of reasons. One is you can sort of pin down what you think will be the communities of interest and neighborhoods that you're going to protect. And two, it gives the public something to react to. Very often you don't get a lot of participation in the early stages of the process, because folks are just sort of, they're not sure exactly what you want, and they're not really thinking about the issue so much. But once you give them a map with something on it, that's when they start getting very interested in how the map is drawn. So this is not a district map. This is simply just sort of laying out what are the building blocks of your districts. You'll ultimately have to produce a draft and final map for some review by the public, but think about as you're moving forward, if you have some of the resources, and might put together something more preliminary that will give a sense of what the input from the public has looked like. And generally that's what might be called iterative mapping. So you put out multiple drafts or multiple visualizations of different parts of the county so that folks can react to it, and you have a really good organic process of public input and decision making as you're moving forward. Okay, I think that's it. So it's a lot of information, but I hope it's helpful. So are there any questions or clarifications from what we've covered?
Thank you, Professor. Do we have any questions from Zoom or chat?
I submitted a question, so I'm not sure if it's for Angelo or Paul. When you suggested about, not suggested, but you mentioned that the data won't be available possibly until September. Do you have an idea if it's going to be in the beginning of September or mid-September? And would this affect, if we don't have that information, for us to do our public outreach during the workshops, if we don't have that information, would that make a difference?
Yeah, so you can start collecting neighborhood and community of interest information, right now, simply because one, you have it can be more subjective, because it's simply what are people's opinions of the neighborhoods, and maybe they might want to see some recent census data, but typically it's just sort of a sense of, well, this is what, from what I know about my neighborhood or a community that I think is really important for county government. Here's kind of where my lines ought to be for that community. That's not so dependent on data as much as it is sort of people's opinions. To get to the first part of your question, so the way the timeline is going right now, the Census Bureau is pretty confident about releasing what's called legacy format data, which is sort of a not cleaned up version of the 2020 census data. And they're planning to release that on August 16th. The California statewide database is hoping to clean that data up so it looks like the official data set that we're going to get end of September, so that in advance of the federal official data set coming out on September 30th, the statewide database will have something to work with within about a week or two of August 16th. So that takes you to sort of end of August. And then typically, if the past is a good reflection of this, and taking into account that they have to do some adjustment for prisoner populations, the expectation is that about a month after the end of August, so towards the end of September, there will be a usable data set that everybody, state and local governments, will be able to say, this is the 2020 data set that we have to use to actually construct our districts. Now, again, you don't need that for a lot of stuff. And if you're doing VRA analysis, there are some alternative data sets that are pretty recent. Communities of interest, if you're looking at demographics, you can look at some, again, mid-2019, or there's some other stuff you could look at the state or local level. County, I'm sure, has a lot of, they've got a lot of demographic information that they're relying on that might be available for you to use. So there are some stuff you can use, but the sort of the target date is end of September, is when you're going to actually have data that you can use reliably to draw the districts. That's, again, if everybody is right on what they're projecting, and I think those are fairly safe, but you never know. They originally said they'd have it up by July, when the original deadline was back in April. There are some lawsuits that are still out there in terms of the data sets and things like there's what are called differential privacy methods that are being used by the Census Bureau to protect people's identities. That's being challenged. So, there are some possibilities that might push back some of the releases of the data, but so be aware of that. There might be some court cases, but the timeline that the state and most of at least the ones I've been working with are looking at sort of that end of September as when you get the data. And then you've got to try to figure out how to get all your work done. Now, one thing I should mention, there is a move to try to maybe get some relief from the state legislature to push back some of the deadlines for the counties and cities and school boards to produce their final maps, but that's still pending. So, they may extend it out into early 2022, but something to keep track of, but nothing firm at this point.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great question, Alice. Mr. Kwong, you had some comments?
Yeah, Chair and members. So I think visual tools are probably going to be helpful to a lot of folks here. So to that extent, maybe a little bit of conversation on, and again, not to use it as an influence or anything, but we can certainly go back and show you some of the 2010 maps that were prepared or adopted, so you can see actually how the lines are drawn as one tool. The another tool will be, as mentioned by Professor Anchetta, is using zoning. We actually have a countywide adopted general plan that actually identifies specific boundaries for rural communities and urban communities within this county. And there's over a dozen between the two. If I remember, it's maybe like 15 or 16. And that's just to say that's what they are adopted in their general plan. That doesn't necessarily guide you or is an influence, again, in terms of where you're going to see the changes in the last 10 years and where you might want to go. But definitely from the standpoint of using those tools where maybe Glenn and David can get some of the 2010 maps and then also pull out the general plan maps as exhibits that we can pass out to the committee members for next meeting as maybe just to have it in your binder so that you can refer to it when you need to.
Okay. Mr. Morwit?
Yes, I have a question for Mr. Anchetta. You've given us a lot of information regarding different redistricting committees that work throughout the state, and we're an advisory committee. What really defines the difference between a supervisorial redistricting committee versus, the federal? I mean, I know the federal has a lot more involved, but we seem to have a lot more restrictions on what we use as our division and maps. I mean, maps I understand, and people and population I understand, but what are the main difference? What's the difference we don't have to deal with? I mean, I feel like we get a lot of information the last 2 training sessions, and I'd like to start kind of narrowing down a little bit what specifically we need to do for the county supervisors. Is there a little bit of a overexpression?
Yeah, well,
Get that?
and part of what you're dealing with again is that there are multiple tracks that are going on all at the same time right now, and this can be a challenge because folks who are a little more engaged in districting might be operating at all levels of government. So they're working with. Is Stockton a districted city? I can't remember now. I think if it is, they might be doing Stockton, they might be doing the county, they might be doing state, and the state level redistricting commission draws the legislative lines as well as the Board of Equalization, and they do the congressional districts. And we have one less congressional seat for California this cycle, so that's a whole very going to be a very contentious process, I think, because of the change in the numbers. So you have to also understand that you're implementing the effects of a reform effort at the state level to try to shift responsibility in some instances, and certainly to clarify the criteria that local governments have to apply. So this wasn't the case. You had similar principles, and certainly the federal principles were the same or similar back in the last cycle. But the current rankings just came. Those are basically produced in the last couple of years because of the legislation. So that's why again, it's helpful for the public to understand where the current districts are and what other sources of county information might be helpful to inform your committee's decision making. But a lot of this is happening for the very first time at this level of government. And Connie Malloy and I were 2 of 14 commissioners at the state level, and we a lot of times we didn't know exactly what the right way to do something was, because it was all kind of an experiment back in 2011. And I think you have some experience to draw on from the state level, and obviously there's been redistricting going on in the county and at various levels throughout the state. But the very specific process that you follow is there's some leeway and some room for creativity, and the definitions are not so rigid that you can't come up with your local interpretations and local implementation guidelines. But yeah, this is the first time your county has gone through this kind of process, and the board opted because other than a couple counties that sort of have a particular mandate from the state, your board of supervisors opted for this format. Right? They could have done it themselves. They could have created maybe a hybrid commission. They opted to go for an advisory committee, and a lot of places are doing that as well. But there's inescapably going to be a lot of local politics. There's going to be partisanship creeps into the process, even though it's partisanship or partisan affiliation is an important identifier for many people. It's sort of hard to kind of put that entirely out of the equation, but it's something you're not supposed to really consider as you're drawing the districts to either favor or discriminate. But yeah, that's what makes it kind of exciting too. You're doing it for the first time in your county.
Mr. Kwong.
Thank you, Chair. Committee member, I think maybe on a local level, what we're going to see is a difference that you'll be able to decide actually where the supervisory lines will go, as opposed to where the state decides it. So one scenario could be, as the professor mentioned, we hit 800,000, maybe more. Well, right now the districts are all evenly divided, basically for about 150,000 people. If we hit 800,000 or more, then it's 160,000 people. So 10,000 people in a community has to go move it's like, it's going to be, and this is maybe it's a bad metaphor analogy, you're going to squeeze that water balloon and it's going to be moving all different ways. So moving 10,000 people in one community or another to in those lines and taking into account the analysis that you're going to have with the election law requirements or election code requirements, particularly given the communities of interest, is not, it's a huge task. It's not going to be easy, but it's a huge task. You're moving, and actually, I'm not trying to predict it, but we probably will be close to 800,000 people. And so you're going to have to move 10,000 for each district. And that is actually your recommendation at the end of the day. I mean, it's 50,000 more people basically to the supervisors, and having them take some kind of action on that. And again, that's just a scenario that can happen. There's been a lot of growth in this county in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
I
And again,
wouldn't be
you'll have to
surprised,
wait for
actually.
the, yeah. I'm
Yeah,
sorry, you-
exactly. You will have to wait for the numbers. I don't want to predict it.
Yeah, and again,
Thank you.
you don't know. Some parts of your county may have gone at a considerably faster pace than others, and yeah, but one of the realities too is that somebody's going to be very happy, and other people are going to be rather unhappy with the lines you draw. That's just sort of the nature of the beast. So don't feel bad if you get a lot of criticism, because that's going to happen, because it's very rare that you could come with some magical set of districts that everybody's going to go, oh, that's great, perfect. You accommodated everybody who's concerned about redistricting. It's highly unlikely you're going to get that level of contentment across the county. But hopefully, if you have a clearly articulated process, people understand, they're able to contribute, they understand that that you have to make some tough decisions. You can't please everybody. That at least the process itself will be considered legitimate and certainly one that was worth going through. Now, again, you're an advisory committee, so you never know what the board will do. But at least your process will certainly be well developed,
Ms. Starr?
and accepted.
Ms. Starr?
Hello, I'm not hearing anything on my end.
Is that better?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. You've indicated that cataloging is a key component of the public input and processing strategies. I really have a procedural question, probably more for staff, is who will actually be doing the physical cataloging process?
Yeah. Well, so just as an example, in the state level, the consultant did that the last cycle, and this time I think more at the state level, the staff is doing a bit more of that, but it was done in tandem. I shouldn't say that last time the consultant just did it. The staff certainly had to process it and get it into a shape that the consultants could put into a catalog form. So it was done by a number of folks to put it all together. But yeah, I think you have to kind of figure that out within your own staffing and consultant's contract.
Yeah, this is Dave Bollinger with the county, and we will be following a similar methodology where staff will be collecting, assembling, accumulating all of the public comment and testimony that we receive, and feeding that to our consultant to assist with the map drawing. So it'll be a collaborative effort.
Ms. Baird?
And it's my understanding that the consultant and the staff will keep us from doing things like egregiously violating the Voting Rights Act and, blundering around and doing things we're not supposed to be doing. So I think I feel better about this whole process knowing that there's a backup. There are people that actually know things that can help us out.
Ms. Ibeck?
Thank you very much. I think my question is more to staff, but if the official federal data comes in at the end of September, And so it's really going to be October when we'll be developing some reasonably informed draft district lines. Should we be having additional outreach opportunities to share that with members of the community?
Right. So we have talked about that, and that's actually going to be the RAC's prerogative. You know, I suggest we tackle this from an incremental standpoint. So have our outreach meetings. Let's see where we're really getting the inquiry and the engagement from the communities of interest. And then we can be strategic about it. So if we find, gosh, it all comes down to this one area and we really need to go back and have another outreach meeting and engage those particular communities of interest, then we can do so. But we're prepared to support that if the RAC feels they want to further engage the communities of interest when we get into October. So great point, Pam.
Any further questions? Do we have any further questions from online chat? Professor, thank you very much. Very informative. We certainly appreciate the time and effort that went into the presentation. And we certainly do appreciate all the information that you had provided to us. Connie, do you have anything additional for us? I guess not. So thank you very much. Mo, you have some information for us on the state redistricting. A question came up.
Out to our analyst at the CAO's office, OHTF with the county administrator's office, and she indicated that at the state congressional redistricting front, that there is a public hearing on August 4th. So if you get any comments from the public, my neighborhood, I want it to stay in this county, and if there's any sort of comments about the state or the Senate Assembly or congressional redistricting, please encourage the public to sign up to attend that August 4th meeting. And space is limited, and so in order to actually provide their testimony, it's virtual, but in order to provide their testimony, August 4th is the public hearing for the Central Valley region. So they can get that, they can sign up at wedrawthelines.ca.org. So the county's supervisorial website is wedrawthelines.sjgov.org. But for this state front, just think of it as the same beginning, we draw the lines, but it's .ca.org.
Thank you. Any questions, Mo? Thank you very much for that information. Do we have any, what time on August 4th? Thank you very much, Ms. Flores. Happened. Ms. Flores, did you get that information? She can't hear. You can't sign up yet. You'll be able to do that 2 weeks prior to August the 4th. There is no time set yet for that meeting, correct?
Yeah, and I'm, yeah, to be determined.
To be determined, the time. Okay, any other questions? All right, let's go. Do we have anyone online that has any comments, any questions from the public? None? How about in here? Do we have any public comment in here? Do we have any questions about from the committee members? None? And how about in here? Very good. Thank you very much to Redistricting Partners. Thank you to the staff for all your hard work. Thank you to the committee for showing up. both here and online. Greatly appreciated. And we continue to look forward. Our next meeting is on the 28th. Is that correct? Okay, same room. Thank you very much. Meeting is adjourned at 5:10 p.m.